please, you're not bothering me in the least. Come on in and dive in. In the 1st century A.D., a man caused a riot. His name was Paul, you may have heard of him. And this riot that he caused led to some consternation in the city where he was located. It was Jerusalem. And he was arrested. Not surprisingly, for causing a riot. And the legal proceedings of the day for the Romans, who were in control of the region, obviously, was that their version of Q&A involved beating. And so, because they just wanted to get to the answer. And of course, if you arrest somebody and he's being accused of causing a riot, he might go, I didn't cause the riot, it's not me. So we want to get to the truth of this, and the best way would be to string them up or basically lay them out, bind their hands, and beat them with a whip till they confess something, which you can imagine they would. So they did this. So he was arrested, brought in, and laid out. And when he was laid out, as the centurion, so that's kind of the second level guy, was about to begin having his soldiers begin the process, he said, basically, you can see the quote there, is it legal for you to beat me as a Roman? And he doesn't use the word citizen, but the implication is that I'm a Roman citizen. And the Roman law was that you could not use scourging to gain confession from a citizen. So the centurion backs off, and he's like, wait a minute, what happened? He goes to the commander, and he says, what are you doing? And if you read it in the Greek, there's almost like an expletive in there. Like, are you crazy? What the blank are you doing? This is a Roman citizen. Well, the guy in charge is like, are you sure? So he goes and he has this. This is from the text. This is from our source. So are you a citizen? He goes, yes, I am. Now remember, they're in Jerusalem, so not near Rome. But by this point, of course, the empire is all around the Mediterranean. And so then the guy in charge says, well, look, I paid for my citizenship, which was a process you could do kind of through an immigration or naturalization process. And Paul responds, no, I was born. So the guy backs off. Everybody's listening, right? He's still basically in thongs to be beaten. And he's having this conversation with the guy. And so then the guy in charge backs off. The centurion backs off. The soldiers all back off because they could be executed for having failed to obey the law versus a Roman citizen if he wanted to pursue the issue. So citizenship was a thing for the Romans, right? But it wasn't a thing in most of antiquity. Now when we say citizenship, this is where it gets really kind of tricky for us. When we look at the ancient world and then we think about our modern times, I think there are kind of three aspects that kind of can pop out to us that begin to help us see what is it that we mean with this word. Now, there's a lot of political theorists you can read and do your own research. There's tons of political scientists who are writing on this, and obviously it's become even more of a question in our minds here in the United States, but also in the West over the past, say, decade. When you look at things that are going on in Europe and Brexit and a lot of places, right? So, but I think these concepts kind of speak to this. And that is one, it's the idea of identification, right? That I live here, and that I live here, I am one of these people, right? I just told you I've lived in Winter Park almost 30 years. So I'm a citizen of Winter Park. I identify with Winter Park. I'm not a citizen of Orlando. I am a citizen of Orange County, right? But I identify, Winter Parkians theoretically identify me as one of them. Because of that, as we just heard from Paul, there's privileges and there's some kind of protections, right, that we can utilize by that identification. And in the third layer, which I think is the layer that is the most tricky for people, it's the one that I think people that we battle the most about today, is something that was not known in the ancient world, but we're going to see where it kind of comes in, which is this idea of participation. That because I identify, and because then I have some sort of, we would say legal, although it wasn't always written down, some sense of I could claim identification of a place, right? A specific geographic locale. That's really important to understand, that it's a specific locale in which you say, I'm of this group, not of that group, and vice versa. You're one of us, you're not one of us. You're one of them. Doesn't mean I have to go to war with you, but you don't have the protections here because you're not one of us. Kind of a thing. But because of that then, should or how does that person get to contribute? And so like I'm saying up here at the top there, then this is what we then consider government of the people. which is a formulation that really began to be brought into by the 18th century. So we got a long way to go to get there. But in antiquity, that's not how it was. In most cases in antiquity, when we start at our journey looking in the Bronze Age, this is where we pick up our historical kind of storyline, although our anthropologists will tell us, we begin further than that, but we have no sources for that material to help us. That what we find is it's all familial. It's all relational. We're related to one another in a kind of tribal setting. And there would be a person in charge, the senior member. If it was a larger tribal kind of group, there might be 3 or 4 people who worked together, but they would have been like the grandfathers of their own specific tribe who communicated with each other, and again, they, of course, were cousins too. When you go through history, you kind of work your way through Egypt and what's going on in the Mesopotamian Valley and Assyria and the Hittites, you begin to find yourself in a setting where certain people groups expanded geographically over the control of a certain area. So to start here, they go to here. And when they did in that area, everybody under them became, if they weren't part of the family, became seen as subjects. So there's no use of the word like citizen and no idea of certainly no participation. But in both cases, you would have been able to see identification, like I am one of these people, I belong here, and they know that I belong here, we're all related, or we're all subjects and we're all from this place. And some level of protection. So I am of the Assyrian Empire, and in essence I can claim that if for some reason it became necessary to identify or seek protection. Even as a subject, there'd be some privileges afforded to me in the story. So when we look at antiquity, one broad basic concept now as we think about that third area of participation, and what I like to call the power pyramid. That when you look at antiquity from, in every continent, in every people group that you can study, you see this idea. That there is a sense of a power pyramid in which there is a single, sometimes a few, but a single person at the top. Then there is a second layer of often wealthy, but somehow have accumulating some sort of power, but it's this very small number. And the broad bulk of the people at the foundation at the bottom. And when you look at these across times, you typically see one of 4 characteristics, usually either the rich man or the strong man. And ladies, it is almost always a man. There are very few, particularly in antiquity, moments when you see a female leadership. I'm a father of 3 daughters. I wish it were different. In antiquity, and try to use my time here on the planet to continue to advance the opportunity for kind of all people. But as a historian, we don't get to impose backwards what we wish. We just say, this is what it was. Sometimes it was the holy man and sometimes the wise man, but usually that was in some sort of a pattern together. So you'd have the rich man who would connect with the holy man, or the rich man who would connect with the wise man, and then they would sort of have this kind of connection together. Particularly on the holy man side of things, what you you never see is what we would consider a division, kind of a separation of church and state. Most of antiquity would look at us as weirdos. They would say to us, why would you not want the inclusion of your god or gods in your decision making? Now we'd have an answer for that coming from modern times. We study that in modern Western Civ. But just so you understand, there's almost always the holy man is somehow connected, unless the leader claimed it for himself, that somehow I am also either of the gods or the gods represented in the process. At times you might see a group from that second level as an advisory, but they never had total control by any stretch of the imagination. So this is the pattern that we see in antiquity, and quite honestly, it's the dominant pattern until the 20th century. Today, according to some estimations, roughly half the people on the planet live in some version of what they will call a participatory governing system. Whether they use the word democracy, republic, legislative, parliamentary. So roughly half. And that's only in the last 100 years. So it's when you kind of consider what we think of citizenship today, I at least find it very useful to think, we're the weirdos who have adopted this strategy. And I think at least I would say to myself as I think about modern situations is, wow, this, I bet, is going to be very difficult to hold, or rather easy to lose, because the dominant pattern, right? is X. And when you think about, for me at least, I think of us as a species. So we're not somehow necessarily better than the other species. So we're just a species. And when you consider the human as species, I think there are a lot of times that our natural, normal bent of action comes out. And I try to not be surprised when that happens, even if I don't kind of like what that looks like, in the journey. So, where do we see this change? And again, in particular with that third attribute of that these people who are the inhabitants, who can claim identification, should somehow be able to participate. And it happens on two peninsulas in the Mediterranean. The Italian peninsula, only in Rome, and the Greek peninsula, in many of the city-states. So when you do Greek history, we're going to dive in here. The Greeks go through three waves. There's like a golden classical age, and there's kind of a dark age period for them. And then there's the kind of the time we know most, the Spartans, the Greco-Persian War, the Athenians, Socrates, Plato, that kind of latter phase before the Romans kind of roll them over in the roughly 1st, 2nd century BC. When you look at the city-states in that time period, they, like all the others, largely adopt the power pyramid structure. They largely in that same sense, somebody on top making decisions. The word king is one we use to try to express it. They would never have used the word king like we use it. It's a very anglicized word. But you get the picture. There's somebody at top, or a monarch, right? That there's somebody kind of leading the show, leading the story in the process. But along the way, mostly because of their own interactions with one another, there begins to be something novel that emerges within most of the Greek cities. And it is the idea of the citizen who has some voice in what was going on. Many of the Greek city-states will develop what we would call like an assembly of some of the people who are living in the place, in this area. And it all goes back to how they interact with each other. So when you think of Greece, actually we've got this map just for a second. We know Greece, we know Athens and Sparta, Corinth is here, Thebes is up here, and there's several other city-states. We, just like with Italy, this is more helpful for us. Never think of Greece as Greece, like we know it, like a unified something. They did not see themselves, I'm an Athenian. All the rest of you, I don't like. And everybody living up here in Mount Olympus, you're barbarians. So today, of course, we often, if you ask somebody about Greece, what do you know? They might go Plato, and they might say Alexander the Great, right? Isn't he a Greek guy? Didn't he do stuff? Well, to the Greeks, no, he was a barbarian, because he was a Macedonian. The Macedonians are not Greeks. And of course, if you go there, then everybody north of them in the Balkans, those are the barbarians. That's a whole other great talk video about who's the barbarian. But so these city-states all saw themselves in competition with each other. They were not allied. And this is something the Persians will try to play on when you go through the Greco-Persian Wars, because they're not friends. They're independent. So think of Athens, although we know it's a city, or Sparta. Think of it like we would think of a nation. So independent, unlike the rest of y'all people. I mean, Canada speaks English, Mexico speaks Spanish, so we all have people who can speak Spanish and English. So you can say, well, we're all kind of the same people, sort of kind of, here in North America, right? But no, you're Canada, you're Mexico, we're a different entity. We're a different civic entity. And Athens was a different civic entity with a specific geographical locale. So was Thebes, so was Messina, so was Corinth. And so in these places, as they began to work out who should defend each other, they began growing their armies. And in growing their armies, something began to develop. And that was that the individuals who were participating in the defense began to demand some level of participation in the decision-making. Now, this is the whole idea of what they would call the phalanx battle, and these were the hoplites because the shield was kind of called hopa, something along those lines. But basically, this begins to alert us to an idea that both the Athenians and the Romans really kind of dig into, and it's the idea of the invested citizen. To flip it around, if we were to say, who should get to participate, the Athenians would say, whoever forked over the money to buy this stuff and was willing to voluntarily put their life on the line to defend everybody else. If you don't want to spend the money, you can come in if you want. If you don't want to spend the money, then you don't have to. And if you don't want to voluntarily go defend us, you don't have to. But then you don't get a vote. You don't get to participate because you're choosing freely to not invest. Right? Does that make sense? Kind of see what their thought process. So this idea of the invested citizen becomes really, really important for them. And you'll see it done differently across the Greek city-states. It almost all was male. In fact, it was all male. There was no options for a female to be a citizen. And so a lot of times when we talk about Athens, the modern critique is, well, not every citizen got to vote. And that's incorrect. Every citizen got to vote. Not every inhabitant was a citizen, is the way to think about it using our modern kind of terminology. We don't have to like that, by the way. But we're just saying that's the way for us to think about it when we go back to modern times. And one of the things that you'll see in both Athens and Rome is this idea of economic independence, which of course again plays that role and should alert us to some of the problems, and we'll see this greater with Rome, in that it begins to feel like citizenship is only for a certain wealth class, but it doesn't seem likely that every person could achieve that wealth class. So for us, or at least for me, that's problematic, right? I'm going to go, yeah, that's what the Athenians did, think in those terms. But we're kind of looking back saying, oh, okay. Because maybe there was someone who was willing to volunteer to, I'll defend the city, but I don't have the money to buy the gear. And at least there was no real provision for that. Now, in Sparta, they didn't have to buy the gear. They just got the gear. And as you can see in Sparta, there was after you'd served a while, you were given land to protect you. So you can see with Sparta, it was more of only the issue of investment. But you ain't really given a choice, because at age 7, you were taken off to military training as a male. The women also, Sparta is probably the most free city for women. So I asked my students, if you go back in Doc Brown's DeLorean, where do you want to go? And the answer is universally Sparta, because it's the one place where women had some agency, some opportunity, which is, obviously good. It's where I would send my daughters to go back to, if we were going back to. So it is in Athens, though, that we kind of move them through this idea to what we call democracy. Well, they called it democracy. So the idea that citizens should be more invested. It begins with them rejecting the power pyramid. Draco, all you Harry Potter fans, you go, wait, I know the name. Yep, that's Draco. It's where we get the word draconian from. He writes a written constitution. We've, I think, misunderstood the word draconian to some degree, but I won't digress on that road. It's very important for written law. When you study ancient history, and when you study modern history, I think it's important, that you say, is the law clearly identified for everybody to see? Because when it's not, it's most easily abused by any with power and or wealth. In fact, if I were to make a critique about our society today, and I mean today over the past, say, 45 to 60 years, I would say that's one of the great critiques I would make, is that we've lost sight of the law, and the law no longer seems equally kind of imposed on us. Because if you know as well as I do, if you can lawyer up, you can defeat somebody who can't lawyer up, and so then that's not really what I would consider equal fair justice. But in the ancient world, particularly when the law was not written clearly, right? So Hammurabi writes his law and puts it on massive stones we call steel. It's about 8 feet tall, and it's just written all the way around. And they had it all over the city and the empire. So you could see it. So nobody could accuse you, well, and where's that law? Show me this law, right? It's very clear in the process. But Draco's law was not very nice. And so he's followed by Solon, who really takes the first major step in kind of changing the story for the Athenians. And one of the things that he does here is you start noticing to be involved, it now was only about birth, not about property. So that he's broadening what we would call the citizen base or suffrage. He begins to move all the meetings to an open provisional place, right? So you could get to it. This is another aspect of being the invested citizen, that you can easily participate. Right, so our founders will talk about this, that they wanted government, or they believed government should be close to you, meaning physically close to you. If government is far from you, that's problematic. That's why our capital is in Tallahassee, because at the time of our founding as a state, the main inhabitants lived in St. Augustine and in Pensacola. Nobody lived down here. Now today we would all say it should be like probably here, because it's more central or something, maybe Gainesville. But it's in Tallahassee because that was central and thus close to all the inhabitants. That's the kind of the viewpoint there. And so they're going to make it so that even the common worker could participate. So this is the Greeks doing a really interesting thing. I don't have time to read all this, but he basically made changes in every aspect of life This is important. He abolishes debt slavery so people could come out of kind of the penal system and be included as a citizen. They just arrive in the process. Through this, they actually will bring in a lot of immigrants who were not included as citizens, but they did have an immigration policy that allowed them to be there. Citizens took over the judicials, the first society in the history of the world to allow the average citizen to become the deciding factor in a jury format over their peers, kind of a thing. Again, the ecclesia kind of formed and opened up. Now, as you might imagine, the people who had the power at the top, they didn't like this. So they fought against him, and then after he died, they go through a couple of other major steps for the Greeks and the Athenians, how they're kind of moving through this. And they kind of go back to what's considered tyranny, although it's not what we would define as tyranny. But it basically was a tyranny in the ancient world, particularly for the Greeks, meant you did not have the support of the people. It didn't mean that you were like a Stalin dictator, like we would think, the words we might use in this process. Ultimately, in 508, this will lead to a moment where there's kind of an uprising by the Athenians against, we could say, the aristocratic or the wealth power class who had actually reached out to Sparta and said, hey, hook us up, give us some military muscle. But the people of Athens, what are called the demos, the people rose up and basically installed Cleisthenes. It's important to see this. Cleisthenes, unlike, so Solon comes in and imposes reform. Cleisthenes is rescued by the people. So when we talk about the rise of the demos, we are talking about the people saying, we want to run the show here. And so then this is where we get our first, and I would suggest only, democracy in all of world history. There's a few small city-states or small areas, both today and in the past, say, 200 years, where a democracy happens, but it's really only one. And what happens is you can see the Cleisthenes and the Athenians begin moving to further reform Solon's plan. They basically break down all ties that would limit it to somehow family. So there's still always in these ancient worlds this idea of family connection that might afford you more opportunity than anybody else. They break that down. They have really if we imposed Athenian governance here, I think it would collapse quickly because most of, probably myself and others would be like, wow, you're asking me to do a lot. I mean, they were so involved. Their jury trials, check this out, were 200, we had 12. Think about the last time you were called to jury duty. If you're like most of us, you moaned and you complained to your friends. That's a clue, by the way, of how much we've lost the idea of invested citizen. And it's put us, in my opinion, in somewhat of a dangerous position. There ought to be a sense in which, if you haven't been asked to be on a jury in 3 months, you're calling the count court. Hey, why am I not? What, are you saying something about me? I want to be on a jury trial, right? Because I want to participate. Okay? They were so involved at the local level and at the national level that, I mean, it was a lot. Now, then this then speaks to one of the challenges, though, because think about the average worker. Would they have the discretionary time possible to be as involved as was maybe required or suggested? And they wouldn't. So even in their democracy, you did have these challenges where the average person might not have participated as much as they could, but they were open to participating. This is, when we say democracy, a democracy is where every issue is voted on by every citizen every time. If you're not in that governing system, so you automatically go, oh, that's not us. But if you're not in that system, you're not in a democracy, based on what the Athenians did. Now we've redefined some of these words, and that happens in society, so we're going to have a citizen. So there's your Athenian story. Here's kind of a recap of the whole thing. Very involved with every citizen. Anybody who could become a citizen was expected to participate in that invested way.
Did they have political parties at all, like you could say?
Not really, but you'll see after Cleisthenes, they will once again end up where the Romans end up, which is kind of a wealthy group hanging out together and a less wealthy group hanging out together. This idea of fear of oligarchy, the word we use to say a wealthy elite kind of control of society, that's an ancient idea and an ancient struggle. And I, as somebody who's not wealthy, I always try to think of it this way, that if I was the person making, I don't know, a couple $1 million a month, and I was rolling large, would I not want to protect that also? And I'm just being honest for myself. The answer is, yeah, I would. So then as I think about it as not the wealthy person and what I want them to do or be, I try to think not in a, go do what you do, but just trying to think, how do we address that? And of course, I don't necessarily have the answer for that. Here's what the Romans did. The Romans used it as a battleground, and they did not figure out a nice way to work this out. So in Rome, we go back in time, again, kind of the power pyramid. The word in Latin that they use is imperium, from which you can see, I bet that's where imperial comes from, and empire comes from that idea. And the imperium was who could make the commands. And again, it was a person at the kind of the top at the power pyramid. Kind of the person who was on top of things was the person who could kind of make that happen as they were going along. And so in this journey, then, they had the same kind of struggle. Now theirs was jump-started by a very famous, you may have heard of this, I'll go back. Yeah, the rape of Lucretia kind of gets them frustrated. But let me go back to this plays into what you were just asking. I will come back once. In Rome, you had two basic classes of people, the patricians and the plebeians. Right? And it is exactly what you would think. So in theirs, you would almost say, well, the power pyramid was, again, the king or the person on top who had imperium. Then the small group were the patricians. Then the larger group were the plebeians, right? So everybody else in that process. They, like all the other city-states and all the peoples of antiquity, had slaves, right? So obviously, people who were slaves never had any rights. So I don't highlight this for the Romans to somehow suggest they did something worse. It is interesting when you look at their relationship. You do see a consistent engagement between the patrician class and the plebeian class, because the patrician class was aware that there's more of them than there are of us, and so there was some kind of issue or observation. And there were sometimes through their patron-client system that a person who was of the plebeian class could kind of elevate over time into the patrician class, but in general that didn't happen. In general, it stayed pretty much with just, the breakdown. And so this economic tension will never go away. This will always be what happens in the Roman story as they go along. All right, so then comes the rape of Lucretia, and this leads Lucius Junius Brutus, who was the grandson of one of the former kings, to suggest we need a different plan. And because Lucretia was the wife of a governor near Rome, the city specifically was involved. Now, at this time, the power brokers in the Italian peninsula were the Etruscans. So Rome was not like a dominant society at this point. But they're going to try and break that connection to the power pyramid, to the idea of king on top of things. Let me just check my time real quick. There's no clock in here. Let's keep going. All right, we're doing good. And kind of lead down the way, and they were going to establish what they would end up calling a republic. A government where the people were concerned and involved at some level with things in that process. And to do this, their first strategy was to replace the single leader with two. So imagine right now, Vice President Harris was actually the co-president. And just think back to our previous presidents and vice presidents. We always have a good discussion in my class. Would that be useful? Would that work out? It's always very curious to me. The Spartans did the same thing. They had two leaders on top. And this was kind of like, wow, we're going to have two. How's that going to kind of work out? How will they discuss things? They had, the two consuls, had a veto, at least initially, over one another. So theoretically, they had to figure out a way to work together to kind of pull things off. What was more important was that Brutus and the Senate said, we need the plebeians to be on board with this. So they brought them to here. This is the forum. What's left of it, obviously. And said, we're going to have this. They described the whole process to them. So we're going to include you in this whole story. And they actually had an election of all the plebeians who came to say, will you support this? And they said yes. And again, their system was to say that the things pertaining to the people, res publica, then became what you should be involved with. Now, unlike the Athenians, they did not construct any plan to allow the majority of citizens to participate directly. Their systems were what we would call representative government. So that you would get to choose people to go into some gathered place to make these decisions. And they started off with the Senate, which was only for the patricians, and then this, the Comitia Currita. This was a kind of group that was still very exclusive, but it did provide kind of a counter. But notice, in this, it's really focused on the patricians. So when the Romans start down this journey, the larger number of people, the lower class plebeian people, who, when I say lower class, do not think of them as being impoverished. They weren't impoverished. They would have had a middle class like we did. They just weren't patrician. So it's almost like there's an elite, then there's everybody else. And in that everybody else, there would have been from the impoverished to the people who were fairly well off. Had they had the same option as the Greeks, many of the people who were plebeian could have bought the armor, could have been involved in the army in that regard, and expected to have some kind of participation. So the fact that they don't do it leads to what we call the struggle of the orders. So notice, it's a 200-year journey. This is one of these I like to highlight for my own self, but to my students. We're talking about our country. Like, we've only been around for 240. If you want to stretch it, back to Jamestown, 400, right? So that we still find ourselves today struggling over definitions and seeking to define or redefine or protect an old definition. Don't be dismayed by that. Don't think something horrible is happening. I would suggest the Romans, and to some degree the Greeks, theirs is 130 years, it is instructive to us to realize that people in society and life morphs and changes over time, so it's not necessarily a bad thing for the current inhabitants to say, we, for whatever reason, wish to redefine something. So the Romans are certainly going to do this. And the way that they do this is you can see the plebeians basically using what we know from our Union history, that we just won't participate. We won't do it. So there's going to be a war, we're not going to go fight unless you give us something. And so then they get the comitia tributa. You can find actually another word for this, but if you, and I'm not a Latin expert, so I'm just putting in the legal term, the assembly. So you have the Senate and you have the assembly. Now again, the assembly, we've already seen, this is the second one of these, and I'm going to show you a third one in a minute. So they actually had multiple groupings of places where people would be voted in as representatives to then go and kind of speak for the group that they represented. The third one involves military, and it was both patrician and plebeian. So if you were a military veteran, you had your own kind of assembly gathering, and then over time, each of these groups, particularly this one and the military one, which I'm going to show you, gained authority. They gained the ability to make some certain piece of decision. All the while, the Senate still maintained the majority control, and at least initially, the two consuls having imperium. So even though there's these groups, they're debating back and forth. And this is part of the questions, like who should get to make the decisions, and they're debating it over time. But strictly on kind of an economic basis is kind of the place where they are doing that. In 450, they follow Draco basically, and they put the laws down. It's called the Law of the 10 Tables. This will be what's really preserved for us in our understanding of Roman law when you get to the fall of the empire, Justinian in the 5th century AD. Will be preserving the Roman law for us and really becomes a foundational piece for Western society. But again, so this is just helping the average person know kind of what rights and privileges, part 2 of our 3 parts, and they have in the story. This is the military one, the Comitia Centuritate, because the idea of century and the centurion, these words are all connected to an aspect of how a Roman army was established or designed for units that they had. And this one, again, is already noted, plebeians and patricians. But again, back to the question you were asking, you can see here, even in what should be, and we're all equally getting to speak in this group, that the wealthier soldiers began to command more authority. Again, it's obviously something within us as a species. Somehow that happens when you get to that process. Notice that this group became responsible for electing all the top officials, including the consuls, taking that from the Senate. And then finally you get to the final movement that takes us to 287. 287 is considered the end of the struggle of orders because of what happens there. along the way you can see there begins to be more rights and privileges granted to the citizens. So previously there was a can't marry somebody in, and they got rid of that, right? Eventually you began to see that even the consul and some senators were from the plebeian class. So that becomes an aspect that kind of develops where you have citizens having opportunity for political advancement in the process. Then in 287, basically a law is passed that the decision-making of the plebeian assembly becomes the final word for the total society. So this is where you really get to the point where it mimics, or it is what we tried to mimic in 1789 with the idea of the two houses. The Senate obviously reflected straight back to the Roman Senate. And then the House of Representatives reflecting this idea of the average person's place. Right? We'll talk about it in a moment, but remember, when we build the Constitution, as we'll talk about in 3 or 4 months, the House of Representatives is our one nod to democracy, where every citizen gets to vote for their representative, and they do it every 2 years, which is a pretty quick turnaround. And the idea, thinking back to Athens, is that we would want as many different people as possible getting to be the representative from your district to the House in Congress every 2 years. They did not imagine what we know from political science point of view of the kind of legacy or the leverage that the current person has when they're in office. But the idea there, as you see here, is that the Assembly makes decisions. So our House, when they wrote the Constitution, they gave them responsibility for writing the budget. When you hear people today wanting to know why hasn't the president announced his new budget, you hear somebody saying, I have no idea how our government is structured. Because the president, I'm still waiting for a president of either party to stand up and say, don't ask me, it's not my job. It is not I'm not supposed to give you any hint at all about the budget. It lays with the House of Representatives. The Senate's not supposed to either. They're supposed to respond to what the House gives them. And why is that? Because it's the one House, it's the nod to democracy, so it's the people's house spending the people's money. All right, so here's kind of reflection, right? So a year before Clisthenes, right? A year before Clisthenes, 508, when the Athenians arrived at the demos, having the kratos, the democracy, the right to rule, they overthrow the republic and establish the Respublica. And then they, of course, then have this roughly 300-year group to where there's 3 different assembly groups. The first one that I showed you begins by 287, 250 to really diminish in importance. So it's really the Senate and the 2 assemblies who kind of make decisions. The regular assembly of the plebeians and the assembly of the soldiers, basically, in that process. And again, the assembly becomes the de facto power. Any decisions that they made were kind of binding for the whole society. And their person that they elected, really, the consuls are not the direct equivalent to the president. In the Roman story, it's the tribune, because he's chosen by the people to be their guy, in essence, to protect them from the Senate. And over time, the tribune gained veto power over the Senate and kind of decision making. So you see power shifting to the plebeians. But at no point do you see them allowing all citizens to vote, certainly not allowing all inhabitants or to participate in direct rule. So then when you look at the Roman version of citizen, again, you get this picture of the invested citizen, this idea, this will be what really drives our founders. When you think about our founders, what they were thinking when they chose Rome rather than Athens, this is where you're looking at. So the idea that there'd be some moral character, this is very Lockean too. So when we get to, I'll show you some John Locke in just a second. But when you think about our founders, thinking about like their driving ethos, it is coming from John Locke mostly. And that idea of you can have, if you have good people, they will willingly, or like the Greeks, voluntarily participate. All right? Now George Washington, when we're fighting the American Revolution, we'll figure out that's not actually how our species operates. So there's a conversation there. And then for us, as well as for the Romans, Cincinnatus, for which you probably go, oh, that the city of Cincinnati? Yes. That's kind of where that comes from. And he was an example in one of the many wars the Romans had in conquering the rest of the peninsula, they needed a leader. He stepped into the role, took the role, gained all the power, gained all the success, and then just gave it all away. It is interesting, or maybe funny, to me, that both our founders and the Romans would highlight Cincinnatus, because it's not like there's a bunch of them. He's pretty rare, and if you know our story about George Washington, he's considered very, very rare because on 2 separate occasions, he gave away power, and you don't see that. And you don't see it in the Romans either. There's only Cincinnatus. There's not a whole bunch of them, and that's actually kind of what happens to the Romans, is that they don't have a Cincinnatus to kind of lead them. They get a bunch of other, I guess maybe normal humans, a person like me probably, who more easily becomes kind of wrapped up in their own opportunities and their own wishes and their own controls in the process. So just to compare it, just to make sure before we move forward in time, the Romans, it's an indirect relationship for citizens who could participate. There was a very clear economic aspect for the Romans of who could participate. For the Athenians, or we can say more broadly the Greeks, but certainly for the Athenians, it is a direct participation. It also has the economic connection, at least initially. And then by the time you get to Clisthenes, if you were male and you were 18 and you were born to parents who were Athenian, you're voting. It was what we would consider very broad suffrage with no property inclusion. And so to mention property, let's just talk about that just briefly for a second. It's not on the slides anywhere. I think, that property becomes very challenging, certainly in our modern times, to think of when we look back, like, oh, they didn't let people vote, they didn't own land. And it sounds very exclusionary. It wasn't in their mind to be exclusionary. It was in their mind to be the evidence that you were invested. Because if you bought land in the place within the civic locale, then you theoretically are wanting to stay there. And you would theoretically want it to prosper. Now again, I don't think land as a classification would remotely work in modern times for lots of reasons. And so I would never suggest that if I was given a magic wand to sort of do something with citizenship. But when we hear about it, I don't think we should hear about it and think poorly of these people from ancient times, whether we're talking about Rome or Athens or our own founders, but think, oh, they're talking about the level of investment. In other words, you want to vote here? Buy some land. Show us you want to stay. And when you do, you can vote here. Now again, there were other exclusions. Again, women most famously. And in our country, anybody who wasn't white was not included, right? In most places. So there's other things that they would come up with. But when you hear the land thing, I try to be very generous with that and kind of reflect on, well, what were they thinking about, in the process? Okay, so one other thing the Romans had differently than the Greeks, and I mentioned this already, is just this idea of law and the legal connection, kind of a legal standing as a citizen. In Athens, it would almost be more clearly, were you from there? And one of the things you don't see with the Greeks is you never see the Greeks expanding geographically. Part of that was because they were consistently in a kind of small United Nations tension kind of thing. I cannot expand without taking from you. But, there were times like the Spartans controlled the Peloponnese. But if you went back in time and landed in the Peloponnese and you went to Messina or you went to some other places, they would not say, oh, you're in Greater Sparta. They would say, no, Sparta is that little place down there, but they dominate us. So you don't see the Greeks doing what the Romans do. The Romans, all to the contrary, they capture land and they just take it. And I probably should have had that map there on Italy, because by the time you get to, say, 200, all the Italian peninsula is, the one color, like with color maps, of Rome. And so now with Rome, you had this challenge. You had people that you dominated, and you, in essence, were bringing them in, and you were considering all of that land Rome. All of the peninsula, and in Sicily was considered Roman. But they're not even anywhere close to the city. And they're not, obviously, bloodline of the city. What do you do with that? And the first people are the Latins. And you can see there, what they did is they extended a legal status of citizenship to the people who were not of Roman bloodline. And so the Latins, who were a separate people altogether, become the first of really all the peninsula. And this is one of the struggles that the Romans will have throughout their journey is, do we extend citizenship to this group? And at times they will choose not to, and then that group will be frustrated and will demand citizenship inclusion. And this is where you kind of can loop back to Paul, right? Paul's from the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. He's not from the peninsula. He's not from Greece, but he's able to say, I was a born Roman citizen, showing how this legal status had now been expanded all the way across. So thus, here you can begin to see that the Romans think differently than the Greeks, that the specific geographic locale is expandable. And as we expand it, you get included. But most of the time, they're not voted. Now that, I think, is largely because geographically there's not going to. There's no provision for Paul's family to vote in Tarsus and then send those votes to Rome to deal with the assembly. And in a lot of places the Romans controlled, they did allow them to maintain some local kind of governance, and those places would often have citizens mimicking the Romans, in that process. So, in all three areas, in both cities, you see these three areas, just to re-highlight this, bringing back. And in neither of the cities do we see all the inhabitants having all of these three characteristics. And obviously, the third one, the participation piece, that's the one that we kind of, lose. And I think it's useful at this point just to suggest this is what the French noted when they wrote their first constitution after the Revolution. And it'll go and come and go, and they will not like this either. And they'll change it and go in different directions, the French will. But you see them trying to classify. How can we explain to people the difference we're talking about? And they use this word active and passive. And again, that's not anything that was used in Athens or in Rome. But it is the idea that you could be a citizen with legal standing. Paul, able to say, hey, I'm a Roman, and yet not have participation within the civic decision-making. And they, at least, in the French too, did not necessarily see that as an evil or a bad thing. Now, if you were one of the people who was classified into the passive, you might say, well, I don't like that, because I want to have a vote, which is usually where our struggle has been in the country. I agree with that. I think that's a fair observation, that I don't like that. That if I am here, particularly if I'm trying to invest, like if I'm a poor kid and I join the military, right? I'm showing you, like the Athenians, I want to invest, let me vote. So that's where the tension kind of really rises. Well, in both Rome and Athens, now this gets back to governance, not so much to citizenship, but the idea of allowing the citizens to participate, very difficult to hold. Again, noting, as I said to you, currently maybe half of the world's population is in what is claimed by their leaders to be some sort of a representative, participatory system. It's very rare. You just don't see that. And the Romans and the Athenians lost it almost as quickly as they got it. For the Athenians, there's really due to what happens with the coming of the Persians and that whole tension. For the Romans, it was really that struggle of expansion. But in both, you see then this problem of the economic divide we were talking about earlier. The sense of it just never comes across as equal. And again, I would maybe just offer that as a people, this is actually very close to we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the USSR. And some of you, like myself, are old enough to remember that whole moment. And that was one of the few communist systems. And if you study Marx, the principle inherent, at least in the philosophy, is that we will find a way to get complete equality across the board. Now, I don't think they pulled it off, but the theory and the idea was to kind of confront this issue of this challenge to power by the wealthy. And again, before I cast stones, I try to remind myself, how would I be if I was in that way? I'd like to think maybe I was not that way, that I would claim power, but I can sort of see it. And I won't spend a lot of time here because I knew we wouldn't have much time for this, but just what happens to the Athenians. Again, the Persians come in, and because of that, the success of the Greco-Persian War leads the Athenians to kind of move into an imperial stage of controlling and domination, which allowed more money to come in, which allowed for more opportunity for the wealthy to kind of take the throne, take the control, and then the whole thing kind of plummets. Power in Greece shifts to Thebes, then shifts to Macedon, which was the power system. King Philip and then King Alexander, they were kings. They used the word king, but they were the dominant power. So there was no thought of the Macedonians to somehow mimic this idea of allowing the demos to have kratos. And the Romans come then after that. And for the Romans, if you know, once the Punic Wars with Carthage end in the 2nd century BC, they're just a mess internally. And every attempt for reform ends badly. Some of the reformers end up being assassinated. Then you get all kinds of different people talking past each other, I guess we might say. And in that talking past each other, you have this setting in which they failed to make any more reforms for their constitution. They failed to really address the economic inequities. And then interesting, perhaps more tellingly and worrying for us, I feel like when you look at the late Roman Republic, one of the greatest dooms was that they had become so powerful and so wealthy that the majority of the people lived in a level of excess and luxury that they were addicted to it. And so in that addiction to luxury and excess, you cease to have any desire to participate. You cease to have anybody doing for you. And all of a sudden, if nobody's poor and can do it, and you're not going to find enough slaves to do it, and people begin to worry about properly, I think about slave economy in Rome, it becomes unsustainable. And that might be something that we should think about. Well, when the empire goes down, Octavian will claim to be protecting the empire. When Professor Robinson's here, he's going to go into much more depth and have greater skill than myself. I would suggest that at no point does the Republic continue. There was some voting in the 1st century, but increasingly smaller and smaller percentages. The emperor, first Octavian, then Tiberius, and then all the way to Nero, Caligula, all of that. The emperor claims control. He claims godhead. And we go back to the power pyramid. After Constantine sets up the empire to move to Constantinople, so to modern-day Istanbul, over near the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, in Turkey and in the Balkans area, right? It's absolutely power pyramid. There's no control. And then, of course, we head into the Middle Ages, and you just have, in the Middle Ages, the feudal system, which is kind of mimicked off of the Roman patrician patron class scenario. You had a rich person who was kind of the patron of these underlings, these poor underlings, and they owed allegiance to him. And you see that kind of embedded in the feudal system. And everywhere we go back to subject period. You will see the birth and the rise through the feudal system of the kind of familial government. And as you move through the Middle Ages, if you study Western civilization in the AD period, all governance, or places we think of, we've got France, Austria, it's really just a family that's in control. So imagine all of Winter Park being controlled by one family. And the 30-something thousand people who live here, you're living on their land, at their allowance. Right? But it's all their land, they own all of it. And then some other rich family owning all of, say, Orange County. And he's the Duke of Orange County. They're the Margrave of Winter Park. Right? All the land is theirs. So the inhabitants, you're just subjects. Unless you are part of the family, then you're within the familial system. So we regress back to the norm, back to the general sense of things. So return to the power pyramid. Also in Rome, it's interesting, is the papacy, or Christianity, becomes the social glue that maintains a hint of Rome. But by the time you get to the 600s and the papacy is established as the papacy, and Rome has achieved dominance amongst all the other key Christian cities, sadly, I would say sadly, you see it becoming very similar to the power pyramid. Remember I told you at the top, the rich man, the strong man, the wise man, or sometimes the holy man. Right? And so you see that same kind of thing happening there. And then obviously there's a part of what we're doing this to maintain some stability in the midst of chaos, which is fair. Maybe we'll do a talk one time here about the Middle Ages and kind of what that looks like in the process. But it was slowly recovered, right? So you lose citizen as a concept.
But we get it back. By the time the Middle Ages are rolling into the second millennium, right, you begin to have towns emerge. So towns were largely lost after the Roman collapse and slowly restored. And this is actually where we're going to get the word citizen. The actual word citizen is first used in the Middle Ages in various parts of Europe to represent you were the person of a specific city. So again, there's that identification piece. Because what was happening in the feudal system is the towns were breaking the bonds of the typical feudal structure. So again, I'm the feudal lord, I control 10,000 acres, all the land around me is mine. But what begins to emerge is a specific town from which, due sometimes to economics, sometimes just due to luck of where they happen to be, they began to gain their own sense of independence from me directly. And they would do that through a variety of different means, but basically breaking the feudal connection so that you then could be somebody who was not merely a subject or a peasant, a serf on the Chrisman land, but you were someone, you were a city dweller of this location. And it was sort of carved out, again, specific geographic locale, carved out within my land. And I could usually do nothing about it for a variety of political reasons, is the process there. And the Italian peninsula really begins to take this forward in some of these very famous cities, some of you may have visited before. And they begin to attempt to capture the concept of republic. The Renaissance will happen at this point. Constantinople will fall at this point. So there's a kind of a brain influx into Italy, and they begin to learn anew about Plato and Aristotle. And if you read both those writers and Plato reflecting Socrates, there's a tremendous amount of what governance could look like. Almost always all three discussing the concept of the citizen or the inhabitant who gets to participate. And so this is something that the Italian city-states begin to mimic as you go back in time. And they all do it with some various versions of a representative government. None of them will mimic Athens, even though they're reflecting back to Aristotle and Socrates and Plato. Socrates and Plato in particular were very critical of the idea of democracy and much more supported in their writings of a representative government. Obviously, Plato writes the Republic, right? So he's doing that in that process. By 1500, you have thinkers and writers talking about it, and you begin to have these assemblies showing back up again. The Magna Carta, it's not a great instrument, but it gives us the beginnings. They didn't call it this in the document, but it gives us the beginning of the British Representative Assembly, what's called the Parliament, with its two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Initially, the House of Lords having all the power and authority. House of Commons, not much. They'll gain some as we go along. You see this in the Swiss cantons. They begin to also build assemblies. Up the Rhine River from Switzerland, in the Low Countries, which at that time was controlled by the Habsburg family, as they get closer to beginning their 80-year war of independence, they will begin to establish the Staten General, the States General. Even in France, and you may know your French history to know, on the way to the Revolution, it became absolutism. Again, power pyramid, absolute power. It does. But if you back up before you get to the wars of religion in the 1500s, and you read the French political theorists in the early 1500s, you see them along the same lines of where we will see more famous names like Locke and Hobbes. That there is a relationship of the people, that the people ought to have some level of participation, and in France they will have what was called the Estates General. It never, until the Revolution, takes on the same type of role as the Parliament, but there is at least that legacy in France of participation that they should get to be considered. Then we come to these guys. And these guys are the central figures of the American story. So in our time we have left, we want to make sure we kind of bring it up to speed. Like, what's our piece of this? Right? All that background of Rome and Athens, our piece of this. In the 1600s, England goes through massive revolution. It's a fascinating century. They have their second and their third civil war. Their fourth will occur in 1776. You probably thought that was called the American Revolution. It's actually the fourth British Civil War, is what it's called, what it should be called. And Hobbes and Locke will write they'll take different sides of the struggle, right? We won't go into depth of what their theories are. But both of them agreed that there was what they called, Hobbes is the first to say it, Rousseau becomes the most famous for it, but Hobbes is the first to say that there should be a social contract amongst the people in how they should go down the road. Both men will affirm that you can do this with a king. It's interesting, a lot of people think he was anti-king. He was not anti-king. He supported the king in 1689. But their real question is how much power do you give the central authority? That's the real kind of dividing between these two men. So who has more power? And for Locke, who our founders are going to at least initially lean more towards, it's that the people should maintain the majority of the power, and that means the government should be extraordinarily limited. To the point that you almost don't know it exists. Like you rarely hear of the government. It would be a Lockean position kind of in the story. So, for the English, they'll roll through. Again, the First Civil War will be the official English Civil War. Their first Civil War is the War of the Roses. So this Civil War is the official English Civil War. And it's Parliament versus the King. It's a very bloody experience. The parliamentarians will come out of it on the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, and they will establish a commonwealth. Now, what they mean by this is some version of the Roman Republic, some version of representative government. It's interesting in this century, so back to Magna Carta, there is an idea of parliament, but it's really the king allowing himself to be advised by the noble lords, so the House of Lords. The House of Commons was really just a rubber stamp, because anybody who would serve in there would have been handpicked by one of the noble lords. But in this time period, coming out of Queen Elizabeth's reign in the late 1500s, you do begin to have some voting. It's not extensive. I mean, you have some representatives in the Parliament, in the House of Commons, who have 7 voters for their area. And we think our voting is sometimes not as broadly as it should be. Imagine there being 5,000 people living somewhere and only 7 of them get to vote. So, but it was something, right? 7 voting is better than 0 voting, I would suggest. The Commonwealth does not last very long, and I always tell my American history students that this becomes kind of our marker of what we think back to when you get into 1760, what we think it could be. And that the English, it didn't happen well for more than one reason, but I think for one reason is because they had just never done it before. And this becomes useful for our attempt, because then we will have, 130, 140 years of practice in our colonies of the kind of government that we think about in the process. 40 years later, Irish Revolution, and with it, what is considered the English Constitution, although it's not really a constitution as we think of. It's better known as the English Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Rights. So if you Google English Constitution, you'll get this, but you more correctly just Google the English Bill of Rights or English Constitutional Rights. And it basically lays out some of the very things you see in our Bill of Rights connected to our Constitution. But it again established this idea that Parliament is dominant. It establishes the idea that Parliament, as the voice of the people, will meet independently of the King's request, because up to this point the King could choose when to call Parliament or not call Parliament. And it would establish ultimately in the early 1700s that Parliament would have dominion or control over the legacy of the king. In other words, instead of being a family, like I'm here, I'm the king, and I'm passing it to my son, and he's going to pass it to his son, that Parliament could decide, yeah, we're not giving it to that person. We want to go over here and give it to this person, which they will do after Queen Anne dies without any children. And they'll pass it to the Hanover family, and then we'll get the Georges, George 1, 2, 3. Those guys coming in the process. So in this, is that happening, obviously, at the time when the British are in their imperial expansion, and they use that phrase. That they've got people living in India, they've got people living in Jamaica, they have people living in some in Canada, not a lot. They have people living in the Caribbean, and they've got people living in about 4 colonies on the eastern seaboard. And after this moment, they'll have a rush of a bunch of other colonies that are established, kind of the post-restoration from the 1640s to 1720. You get all the rest of our colonies that are established. And all of those people then are largely going to come here with this concept of the invested citizen at the foundational level of what we're going to establish. They will all establish some version of a parliament in their area. They'll call it different things. They'll have widespread voting. When you do study the American Revolution in depth, one of the things that I think is obvious is that what they're really arguing about is definitions. They're really arguing about definitions. And one of the definitions is, what does it mean to be a citizen who gets to vote? Like I told you, there were some seats in Parliament who had 7, 10, 15 people voting. The British would have said, well, there's nobody else there who's invested to own land. Well, the people living there would have said, well, because we can't buy any of the land because it's all owned by the Creasman family. So in the New World, there was all this empty land. Yes, don't throw rocks. I do know the Native Americans were already there. But in general terms, if you go and look at it, they actually were not broadly distributed in the land. So in large measure, the British colonists were coming in, buying or taking ownership over empty land. And so in their minds, lots of people could vote. Again, land not as an exclusionary thing, like we don't want you to vote, you don't own land. It's like, all of you can come vote, come own land. And even into the early or late 1700s, there were some colonies that did allow women to vote. So there were women who got to vote because they owned land. So there's a sense of, there's room for everybody. Now again, that comes at a cost for the Native Americans, which is an important story to understand in our journey. But again, I just want you to kind of see, in that process. Now, what happens is, as they're exhibiting more and more direct control, when the French and Indian War ends, and that's the last of what I call the Second 100 Years' War between England and France, when that ends, King George III and his government recognizes we're in financial peril, and they recognize, it's interesting, they recognize that a group of our citizens are not paying their fair share in taxes. So they step in to make that happen. But because it comes from Parliament, most of the people in the New World, British colonists, felt that that was done without their permission or without their request. And there's a whole conversation we will not have about this issue, right? But the British perspective is you all have a say-so because Parliament is voted on and virtually represents everybody. But the American definition of representation is that it is, again, Lockean, very close to us and directly connected. And so you're not doing that. And that failure to communicate and clarify is what will ultimately lead to the explosion. And it is, in my opinion, a battle about control. Who gets to be in control? And we were saying that the people closest on the ground should be in control. You get that some today, right? There's battles that we have here in Florida, and I'm sure other states, where the state legislature wants to make a decision, and the city of Winter Park, and I don't know if you're all Winter Park residents, but in the city of Winter Park, we're like, no, we think we should make that decision because we live here locally. When you see that happening, that is a reflection back to our revolution. It's a reflection back to this deeper question of who gets to make the decisions for a specific geographic locale. Right? So, all this leads into the Declaration of Independence. And it's interesting, if you read the Declaration, I think you probably know this, the first third's the pretty part, winning the course, human events, become necessary, blah, blah, blah. But the latter two-thirds, it's a legal brief. Like Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams, they wrote a legal document to go to court, to world court, to say to everybody else, hey, we're going to do this. We'd love your support. Here's why we're going to do it. And remember who they're talking to. They're talking to King George's peers. They're not talking to any other nation who does what we're doing. So we're going to be the weird oddballs like Rome and Athens, trying to do something completely different. But we're hoping we can explain why. When you read the first 7 or 8, they're all about this issue of citizenship, control, what they're accusing the king of doing, what they're saying he didn't do in relationship to the people who are the inhabitants in the story. So of course, we win, right? And so then now we have to set up government, right? And they're going to go back to this question of is it us or is it them? How are they kind of developing, working their way through the process? I would suggest that the Declaration kind of reflects Locke, whereas the Constitution reflects more on Hobbes. It's a whole piece we won't have time to get into. But in that process, they're going to write a Constitution. Did you know the Constitution is the second governing document that they wrote? In both documents, they do not ever define citizen, which is very interesting. And most of the reasons they don't in both documents is because they knew the states had reflected. And it's an important thing to recognize that when we fight our revolution and when we win, you did not have very many people who thought of themselves as fighting to form a new nation. They perceived themselves as already existing in the nation of Massachusetts, of the nation of Pennsylvania, the nation of South Carolina. And we would then, as they say here in the government, form a league of friendship, almost like we think of the UN today. And we will work in a confederation way together. And the decision-making power lay closest to the people. So Congress, in a very Lockean way, having very little power under the Articles of Confederation government, and the power lay with the states. Ergo, who gets to be a citizen is whatever North Carolina wants to do for North Carolinians. And if they want to do something different than what Virginia wants to do, that's fine. And the statement in the Articles only basically said that you couldn't limit another citizen of another state. The person can show up in South Carolina and say, hey, I'm from Pennsylvania, here's my proof, whatever that might be, then you could not somehow limit them from being there. There's no mention then of how to become a citizen or be naturalized. Now it's interesting, within a decade we write a new document. And that's a whole other civil war that we fight. And Madison is obviously seen as the father of the Constitution. And he, amongst other young nationalists, criticized this decision. But then when they write the Constitution, they don't really define citizen either. It's very interesting that they choose not to do this. But they do define who would do naturalization, who could become a citizen. And Congress was to make a law to do that, which they do. It comes out of Article 1. They will do that. One of the very first things they will do is establish that there is a method by which someone can choose to become a citizen of the United States. But they still will largely leave citizenship declaration or definition in the hands of individual states. This is why, as I said, some of the states allowed women to vote. Later, in the 1830s and 40s, there will be freed African American men who will be voting in some states. Some cities will allow for them to vote. And so there's a kind of a mishmash, we might say, of aspects. But then that, of course, can be not only be for more liberal opportunities, but more exclusive and limiting kind of rules. So that becomes a problem for us. So when you go through this process, you see the United States ending up with kind of a blended system. So some states today in the world only do this. So in other words, who are your parents? This is who your parents are. And this, of course, there's only about 30 nations today who will have this. If you're born here, you are one of us, regardless. Even if you're just on vacation and the baby's born here, that baby's a U.S. citizen. Or one of the few that does it that way. But again, until we get to the Civil War, which we're about to talk about briefly, there's only free white persons. It's very limiting. And over those decades, you have Asian peoples. Obviously, after the war with Mexico, we have millions of Mexican or Hispanic Americans. Obviously, all the Native Americans. And certainly all the African peoples who were brought here in chains and forced to come here were not included. And like I said, there were some cities and areas that people who got out there were some African peoples who did come, or people of color, I would say that, who did come by their own free will, but they're very small numbers. Most of what we consider free blacks in the North were people who had escaped via the Underground Railroad. Two Supreme Court cases will really help us highlight this issue of how citizenship being undefined. One occurs during Andrew Jackson's Native American Removal Act story. And the very first Supreme Court case the Cherokee Nation brings, Chief Justice Marshall announces basically, we can't hear the trial. He and the other Supreme Court justices were very sympathetic. They hated Jackson. They're very sympathetic to the plea, but they couldn't rule in their favor because you had no standing. You weren't citizens. And then, obviously, more famously, I hope it's famous for you, is the Dred Scott case. So in the Dred Scott story, this man, who was a slave, was taken to free soil in Illinois, lived there for roughly a decade. There's more to it as who the owner was, and there's relationships and the death of an owner and transmission of property to somebody else. But anyway, in his mind, I lived in this place where there should be no slavery. Ergo, I should be allowed to be free at this point. This court goes in 1857. The Chief Justice there is R.B. Tawney. Tawney is a Jackson appointee, and he rules in a very interesting way that I wish we had a lot more time to go into. But the short version is he comes down on this, right? And now he specifically talks about black people. I think if you had asked Tawney, he meant any person of color or anybody not white, right? So then that kind of gets into European, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff related to the race side of it. Because if you ask an Irish or an Italian person who comes to the United States in the 1840s and 50s, the level of discrimination that they experienced was also vastly extensive. But because of the color of the skin, they could slowly gain participation rights by owning property. In most cities, they would be allowed, even though socially they were still seen as second-class citizens. But this statement openly by the court to say that the only citizens can be white people makes this one of the reasons why the Civil War explodes as it does in 1861. So this kind of, you see these two cases kind of helping us see what the Americans were doing in the journey. And this is where it will all lead as the war comes to its conclusion, that Congress says we need to define citizenship for the United States. The Constitution did not. So Congress was dominated by Republicans who were all of abolition aspect. Not all Republicans were abolitionists. So Lincoln, he's passed away at this point, but he's not an abolitionist, right? So there were a group of moderate Republicans, but the real Republicans, the ones who started the party, were all abolitionists, and they had gained control. And so they passed the first Civil Rights Act, 1866, in which it clearly defines citizenship and their rights and privileges as such. President Johnson vetoes it. The veto becomes part of the debate in the midterm election of 1866. And in that debate, Johnson, in his view, will lose and lose large. The Republicans will win back in the midterm election a veto-proof majority in both houses. So they'll pass this. But then, because they're veto-proof, they're thinking, we need to make sure this is long-lasting. So they then decide to make it an amendment to the Constitution. Now, back here just for a second. When this happened, if you use Madison's viewpoint about the Constitution, you shouldn't need the 14th Amendment. Because by being free, and if they could own land, then they should be allowed to have whatever rights and privileges of the state. But clearly what had happened in the next year was, as you see, particularly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, is people of color still being marginalized and mistreated and rejected from the opportunity to be full-fledged citizens. So then the Supreme Court Act, then the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment then takes what the Civil Rights Act and makes it part of the Constitution. And in fact, historians of Reconstruction will say this is the crux of Reconstruction. The whole story of Reconstruction flips and hinges right here. So if you ever want to do a study on Reconstruction, and we're going to have at least one of our civics conversation, and probably 2 or 3 of them that are going to go deep into the 14th Amendment. So I do hope you come back for that, as we want our political science professors, and Professor Bryson, I mentioned also, are going to be looking at the importance of the 14th Amendment. Because once it's defined as citizenship, you then kind of open that door for what does that mean, back to our kind of 3 points. Identification is easy enough, but what about rights and privileges, and then what about participation? How do we get to participate? Who should get to participate? And that becomes the 14th Amendment's kind of legacy. It's the first time that we get this idea of what we call civil rights, which obviously, you know, in the 20th and 21st century is the central part of our discussion. When you talk about rights and race and inclusion and opportunity, it all comes to this idea. If you had tried to have that conversation in 1822, they would have laughed at you. They would have not known what you meant, because the concept did not exist until the 14th Amendment. And I promise we are almost done, and if you have questions, I am going to let you ask them. Well, similarly, 13 to 14, 14 to 15, we shouldn't need the 15th. once we've clearly stated who the citizens are, but again, unfortunately, within a year, it was very clear that in the South and in some places in the North, they were still determined to limit who could participate in the vote. So then this led to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was, in one sense, unnecessary but vital, because it clearly states that a state could not choose to make any law to somehow limit inclusion in the participation aspect, what we would call the suffrage, the right to vote, based on race. Now, it's interesting, when you look at that discussion, the key civil rights leaders that we know kind of moving in the abolition movement, who are still alive, were deeply involved in that. And they were approached by women's rights activists and leaders at that time, Susan B. Anthony and others, begging them to let's do it all together. Let's say race and gender, race and sex. And the African American leaders were afraid that it wouldn't pass. So they said, well, we're going to have to wait, but we'll help you. Unfortunately for women, then that meant another 60 years, right, or 50 years to 1920, till they got their right put in. Some states early let women vote. Again, the states are still the area where it's defined as who gets the inclusion in that process. And so by 1870, then, we're in this place where we can say all three aspects are now kind of included, for the United States at least, in this one concept of the 14th Amendment, and then its legacy outward from the 14th Amendment. As I just said, that did not mean all the questions were answered. It just meant that we'd sort of reached this point where we could say, what is it that they were doing? Right? And so the founders then believed the people should create all the rules for where they lived. So government is us, not them. There's no them in government. It's us doing it. And then these people would have a shared experience, shared histories, shared language, shared storyline. New people could be included, absolutely. They just needed to be willing to embrace it, right? You want to come here and live, like I said with the Romans, the Athenians, buy some property and show me you want to stay. You want to stay, then you want to know our story, and you're going to weave your story into our story. And of course, we use images like the melting pot. My favorite people is Wynton Marsalis, and he says instead a better imagery is to think of it as gumbo. And that when you make the gumbo, you have to have the roux, but when you make gumbo and you're done, you can't pull the pieces out. It's just this new thing in the pot of gumbo, but it's got all the pieces. And I love Wynton, and I love that view. But it's a sense of usness, right? So it's us, that's what they're working on. That the government, then, if it's of the people, right, then we need to figure out who those people are. Who are those people? And so they do with the 14th Amendment. And that kind of takes us then to this idea that they saw born in Greece and Rome and Athens, probably more specifically. And I'll end with this. John Adams, when he was describing the Republic, goes back to this idea then of legal connection, right? That every person is equally bound under the law. And so you see that then enshrined, I think, in what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are trying to do. They're trying to say, if you're born here, or you choose to join us through naturalization, then everybody's equal. As I said, in one sense, I think this slide might say the issues we have in front of us today, which, as I told you, I will not be trying to solve or answer for us, is, what will be the question of inclusion. And certainly the struggles, certainly in the 20th century, but really for us from 1874, is what are those limitations? Can there be limitations? Should there be limitations? And how are those applied? And are the people who are there, the citizens, are they getting to decide those themselves, or is it a them who's deciding for us? And I think perhaps for me the biggest challenge is that we've lost, as I suggested, the concept of what it means to be the invested citizen, and seeing it as some privilege, and then it involves my voluntary inclusion and desire to be there. And that's a whole other conversation. And so I will stop there and see if you have any questions that you would like to ask me. And there's my email if you want to email me anything. But is there any questions that anybody might have?